Philosophers talk to our times towards an ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. Hannah Arendt, as so often, makes a wonderfully useful distinction between the way you understand the normal social situation and that what happens, what has to happen on the eve of some autocratic takeover. She talks about an emergent class that she calls the mass. And the point, of course, about the mass is that it is a group that are separate, that have been rendered somehow surplus by capitalism, so that whether they live or whether they die does not matter. And they know it. And so that they self-consciously know that they are beyond the pale. There is nothing in the system that can help them. And therefore they've got no stake in it. Why would they have? And they are very open to the initiations, to the rhetoric of those that would whip them up to smash the system. And replace it with who knows what autocracy that might help them just a little, just enough, that might at least reap their revenge on that system that made them isolated, alone. For that was the thing about the mass. Torn out from society, not given any money. They become very caught in their own misery. Now, she is making the point against the rise of autocracies in her lifetime in Germany and in Russia, and trying to understand the difference. In the modern version, that last point, that being alone, has become more complicated. And I think the axis has opened up. First of all, of course, there is a point throughout the return, throughout the apotheosis of monetarism, so the last, getting on for 50 years. That idea of the mass defined as a group that are somehow surplus to population and that are somehow poor, being rendered poor by a capitalist system that doesn't really need them anymore. That group then that Marx might have once called the lumpen proletariat, pushed out of a system, pushed beyond it, has become just the dominant, has become one of the recurring political themes. When I was a very young teenager, so about 1980, I very clearly remember living as I did in West London, the rise of the skinheads as the children of Thatcherism, and the NF being written in so many places. Racism in many schools was totally normalised. It was almost, to say that it was acceptable was wrong. It was never acceptable, but it wasn't a sin against the spirit. Most of the white kids would confess to being a little bit racist. It wasn't a pleasant place, but the world they were going into wasn't particularly pleasant. They felt themselves to be the mass. They were that group that when they were released from school at the age of 16, usually, there simply weren't the jobs there. And so they had to invent things to do. And get past that feeling of utter isolation in which they are caught. But of course, we have added or shifted or changed that feeling. Isolation is no longer simply about being alone. The world of Hannah Arendt was one of those worlds that was curiously modified, I think I would say, by the internet. In my day, when I was an early teenager, back in the 1980s, what held groups together, subcultures together, was music. And in that music, the loneliness was expressed, made tangible, made somehow real. And it was articulated into violence, but that meant that you could have battles on the level of the music. and that the mass could re-find an identity that was not just pure isolation within subculture. And there was a huge part of subculture that was one of the things that allowed one to continue in spite of the hopelessness, because it made the hopelessness into something positive. It created it into a force. It articulated it back on itself, so it was no longer isolated. And so the Hannah Arendt principle became then a limiting case. Because before you got to that limiting case, you invented a subculture, found your friends, and found some sort of voice, even if that voice was essentially powerless. So essentially unable to change the world in which it impacted. It was real enough. And then, of course, the internet further changes it, just hugely. And it changes it in multiple dimensions, so that the Hannah Arendt principle has shifted. The mass, the loneliness, is no longer a direct product of capitalism. Oh, don't get me wrong. The society in which we live, wastage is the norm. It's just simply what happens to large numbers of people constantly. AI is just the latest incarnation, hitting a different group that thought that because they did conceptual jobs, they were somehow safe from technology. And also hitting my crowd, the artists. All that stuff. But that isn't what drives the mass onwards, or not solely. The mass has become a subculture that is endlessly whispered. And a very dangerous one, because it creates its own vacuum. A vacuum that it then fills in terms of a subculture. Let me give you 2 real examples from recent history. I think this is going to be today and tomorrow. So the first example that's worth remembering 10 years on is Brexit. What was really driving Brexit? Oh, as so many of my cast, although it was unimaginable, I had a warning about Brexit. Years ago, we had a plumber, and I remember he told me, I've never voted. He'd never voted me, but I'll tell you what I would vote for. I would vote for if they ever wanted us to leave the EU. I'd vote to do that. And that was because he felt himself to be in a class that was peculiarly being disadvantaged by the EU, by plumbers coming over and putting pressure on his job. More than that, he felt that he had gained nothing from it. And he was representative of a whole set of people, he told me. And these were the people, of course, that Tony Blair betrayed. And the level of the betrayal that it felt of New Labour is difficult to remember. I lived in the southwest. Let me give you an example. Now, when Tony Blair came in, what did he do? He got Cornwall grade 1 EU status. Okay, that meant Cornwall got a huge amount of money from the EU. Really a vast amount. It was at the time, it still is, one of the poorest areas in Europe. Once you get out from the glitzy glamour. Okay, absolutely. And how was the money used? This is one of the extra things you'll add that Hannah Arendt probably does. When you're throwing money at a mass problem, doesn't solve it. It doesn't solve it. Why? Because who does the money go to? It won't actually go to the mass. It won't go to those who feel themselves disadvantaged because they'll never apply for it. Part of the problem is that you won't be able to reach them with the money because they're not in the straight economic system, or they've isolated themselves from the system. And that was, of course, what happened in Cornwall. I very strongly suspect it's what happened in the north as well. Gordon Brown made available huge amounts of money and said, we're giving this amount of money and this amount of money, as if the money itself was the solution. The problem is that once you've got a mass, you've got a group that's actually hard to spend money on in ways that are constructive. So what tended to happen, and this was from my experience in the arts world in Cornwall, was that the money was spent on us lot, on middle-class artists, and on big fast roads that helped the rich. Nobody could define how you could spend money that would help the very poorest in society. Or if they could define it, they couldn't be asked to define it. I think it was difficult. That was my analysis at the time. And so all the money did was create absolute fury, because it reminded a certain group of people that they were cut off from all the rest, and were going to stay cut off when all the money went out, money they didn't think they were getting at all. Now, how much they didn't get, I don't know. Certainly the internet in those days, which was it was a long time ago now, but it was full of fury and full of tales of fury, and was beginning to cut in, because of course it is the modern articulator of the mass, that modern articulator of the feeling that we never get anything out of this. And even when you do get something out of it, it will tell you that you get nothing out of it. So anyway, it meant that there was a lot of anger against the EU because of the money. Because the money had not been spent, or could not be spent, on that group that was hardest to reach. Because they were separate from the overall society. Another classic example, so hence the Brexit vote. It came out of the blue. Cornwall had no business, logic told everybody, voting for Brexit, and has become even poorer without it. Absolutely. It impoverished itself, and they discovered that some of the money, just some of it, did eventually arrive in their general direction. So it has been an absolute disaster. But why they voted for that disaster is also totally understandable. Because when people tried to help them, most of them were not helped. And I suspect the same is true, although I don't know firsthand, throughout all of Northern England. Tony Blair was full of schemes that were going to help communities. And I think it was absolutely full of communities like the old ones I used to teach in Stoke-on-Trent. They were not changed. They were just gentrified by these schemes. And that group that is hardest to reach, the mass, the group that's pulled out from society, certainly would have felt they weren't rescued at all. Likewise, money, if you've got the mass, does not solve the problem. Even if you can reach them, and sometimes I think you probably can, often their entire subculture will be based around the fact that you can't reach them, that they haven't been helped, that nobody has ever helped them. Because that has become long since an identity of vacuum, an identity of being beyond and other to the system, of loathing the system. There's a wonderful dog fight going on if you're wondering what the noise is. And of course, exactly the same happened with COVID. COVID created a mass in a slightly different place. One of the groups that had survived the assault of neoliberalism was the festival trader crowd. So that's another one of my groups of people. They were all self-employed. Many a hippie was very, very capitalistic. If you wanted, I used to watch the way they used to educate their children to always be making money, because money was their stake in the system. It's how they felt part of the system. And it was based on face-to-face trading, all of it, constantly, of various articles. It was based on relationships built up, on things that they made, things that they sourced from India. On this group of people, of course, COVID turned them immediately totally surplus to requirement, because it took away their profession. It didn't compensate them. It left them very much in a lurch. In the festival world, companies went down because they weren't particularly supported, and the entire model for festivals was for 6 weeks, months of the year, you don't use storage. And if you need storage and aren't doing anything for the rest of the time, companies just go. So here it suddenly created a new mass where there was no mass before. And what happened? Strange stories started to spread amongst just this community that this was all a scam anyway. It was somehow to create this level of pain. Masses became internalized, became their own truth, became their own reality, became a political party of COVID deniers. Why? The Hannah-Arendt rule. Mass had been created. It had created its own subculture. That subculture becomes the truth. And once it becomes the truth, you cannot easily reach it. If you throw money at the problem, it doesn't work. If you throw truth at the problem, it tends to not work, because that truth will tend to come from various angles. It always will do. It will come from exactly those positions that these people feel that they have been most alienated by. And you'll get nowhere. You'll get nothing. All you'll get is the hard reality of the Hannah-Arendt rule. That group will feel more alienated by what you say and not less. The creation of mass groups that feel themselves at various points disenfranchised, and then that disenfranchised becomes its own subculture that is fundamentally very hard to reach, has become one of the begetting truths of our society, one that haunts us and again haunts us in a world where we're trying to sort stuff out, in a world where there are increasingly always going to be, in a world of climate poverty, groups that are going to be hard to reach, difficult to bring along, or suspect that they are, or believe that they are, or that being told they are in the endless game of Chinese whispers. And the challenge of thinking through how we survive the next few decades is how we include all those masses once again in whatever ruse we want to follow to save us.